Thank goodness there are games in college football. There's been so much else to discuss, and it's been invigorating or sometimes stunning what we've seen when it comes to realignment and additions and much more. Max Olson, theathletic.com senior college football writer. Max, we were asking this question on the show. Have you heard on the additions of the ACC, if in fact they are, and even SMU, would they get a Tier 1 full share like California, Stanford, no matter what they decide to give up going into it?
You mean eventually, like down the road?
Well, like, for example, if the pro rata kicks in immediately, whenever that is in 24, would the networks be paying Cal, Stanford, and SMU full shares, even though they're going to give up some of that and give back to the ACC?
Yeah, I know, it's a good question, and I think that is, and I've seen Ross Dellinger and others have done a good job of laying this out, that I guess that is ultimately the upside here, is if the ACC can get ESPN to fork over more money on a pro rata basis, then the question becomes, obviously SMU is volunteering to not take any money and to fund themselves for an extended period of time in that league if they can get into the club. Then the question is, what is kind of the minimum amount that you could fund Cal and Stanford at in the near future here before eventually bringing them up to a full share? And then can you take that money and distribute it to the rest of the conference? Can you kind of make the case for the especially the schools that have been asking about the grant of rights and things like that adding them ultimately can be financially beneficial for the rest? I think that accounting is bottom line. That is the reason these conversations are still going on.
Max, what I don't understand, or I'm failing to get here, at least on this, is can you get enough money among the schools that are threatening to leave or unhappy about the grant of rights to keep them happy? And if you can, how much money would be really left over for the ones who just want to keep the league together?
Right, and ultimately these go back to the conversations in the spring about, okay, well, let's kind of have a little bit more performance-based revenue sharing and stuff like that. But ultimately, we're not talking about a huge sum of money. And as we've heard from Florida State, clearly the concern is the broader gap between them and the SEC. And this kind of money we're talking about bringing in to add the two Pac-12 schools, like, yeah, and FBU ultimately. That's not that, if you're distributing it fairly or whatever based on performance, that's still not like making much of a dent in that gap, really. So, yeah, I mean, it feels like more of a short term, like, let's try to placate people and stuff. And then, certainly we will find out if the reality of, if they go through with this, of having to make these Bay Area trips and stuff like that, having to play out in Dallas, is that something that actually people view as beneficial over time too?
Max, do you think or do you get the sense that this is something that will be resolved before full kickoff next week, or do you think this is something that drags out longer than that potentially?
I mean, I wish, I hope,
Yeah,
it'd be great to just have this. I'm sure we'd all, it's given you guys lots of hours of stuff to talk about, but yeah, clearly it would be nice to have this stuff wrapped up. Certainly though, I think between that and then what happens with Oregon State and Washington State and what are the moves and the positioning that the Mountain West and the American can make here. Certainly this is it looks like this is going to drag into the season a little bit, but hey, it was that way in 2021. I remember covering the Friday Zoom press conferences to introduce the 4 new members of the Big 12, and then having to get in the car and drive out to Iowa to go cover Iowa State the next day. So it's similar to that. It does feel like it's going to kind of bleed into this September here a little bit.
Max, who will be this year's 2021 Baylor and 2022 TCU/Kansas State in the Big 12?
In the Big 12, I struggle with that. We were just working on, we're as a staff, we were just putting together our playoff picks for our preseason content, and like I really struggled to figure out who's the TCU and the Cincinnati this year, like the wild card playoff team. It's tough to like figure that out, and especially on the Big 12 side, like I don't know, guys. I think everyone's talking about Texas Tech at this point, right? There's no element of surprise there anymore, and certainly with the Oregon game in week 2 there, they've got a pretty big spotlight right away to kind of go out and prove it. So Yeah, I mean, it does feel like Texas Tech kind of has a chance to be that team that has a chance to go, possibly win 9-10 games, be in the mix for the conference race here into November. Certainly that Texas game at the end will be super interesting if they're both vying for a spot in Arlington, that game in Austin. But I don't know. I think Kansas is going to be in the mix. I think Baylor, we're all kind of still sleeping on generally. I think TCU probably is not going to fall off as hard as people think. There's certainly, and there's still, I kind of lean toward Kansas State winning the conference. So I think there's lots of teams at this point that probably think they're going to win 8+ games. And it's hard to see maybe a playoff team from that list, but Oklahoma could be the one too. I don't know, guys. I still haven't really put my finger on it.
Max, you wrote an article with Bruce Feldman about the 100 transfers. You had Sam Hartman at number 1. How much of a jump does he alone give Notre Dame that has been under Brian Kelly and now under Marcus Freeman for going into a second year, recruiting really well, but quarterback was always kind of nebulous for them?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a belief among their staff that, this can get them, at least in terms of quarterback performance, that Sam Hartman can get them back to the high level of play they got from Ian Book, who took them to 2 playoffs. I think that he's that kind of a player that can kind of elevate everybody around him. He's fit in super well with this team. I think has a chance to be really the terrific leader that they need. And he can really, put the ball all over the field. I think there's a good enough supporting cast there that Notre Dame's going to be pretty dangerous. And I think there's, it's clear from the conversations we've had that there's some really good quarterbacks in this transfer cycle, but maybe not as experienced and impactful as Sam Hartman. Interested to see how much he can raise the bar for Notre Dame, a team that certainly is trying to take a big step in year 2.
Man, just going through this list, I mean, there's so many intriguing storylines, but at number 7, our guy, Tanner Mordecai, who we covered here during his high school days and have kept up with. How intrigued are you by?
Yeah.
How intrigued are you by this Wisconsin, start with Luke Fickell and the air raid and Phil Longo and Tanner Mordecai and just the whole works there?
Yeah, I think that Wisconsin does feel like kind of one of those sleeper teams this year. If they could put all the pieces together, I think that Tanner Mordecai, you couldn't have found a better guy if you're Wisconsin in terms of trying to make this offensive transition under Phil Longo, because there's a lot of crossover in terms of what Tanner Mordecai learned under Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma and what he learned in his 2 years as a starter at SMU offensively with what Wisconsin wants to do. And so he was really the perfect guy at the perfect time for them to not only come in and be a leader and be a dude that everybody rallies behind, but one who truly does understand the concepts offensively, can pick it up and operate at a high level. And that's the biggest thing with Phil Longo is just, can you kind of fully understand the system and know how to play within it? Because it is pretty simple and it's just a ton of reps. And I think he's been a really good fit for them. They really had to rebuild that receiving core through the transfer portal. I think they feel like they got some good ones, like Green from Oklahoma State and Will Pauling. And they've obviously got one of the best backs in the country in Braylon Allen to kind of build around. And I do think that, what we've seen from Phil Longo when he's in North Carolina is that when you've got NFL backs, he'll play to that strength, like he did with Javonte Williams and Michael Carter. So it's going to be, I think, a really interesting offense to watch, and one that, if it clicks, could be a really high scoring unit that it's going to be jarring to kind of see. It's going to be very different, ideologically from what they've been, but I think they feel like with Tanner Mordecai as the trigger man, they've got the right kind of pieces coming together here.
I just can't wait to see them run it in 4 inches of snow in late November in Madison and try to keep the pace. It's not just about spreading it out and throwing the ball around and wide splits and all that. It's about being able to move at the breakneck speed of, it's about 10 to 15 seconds between, the time they set the ball and you snap it. When it is the weather's like that, I'm curious to see how they pivot to it. We saw here when, Baylor played in cold weather, they were just kind of stuck. But that's the only thing I'm curious about. But I'm happy to see the offense in the Big Ten. I think it'll be really, really interesting.
Yeah, and certainly Smoaky can attest. We saw Nebraska came in and said they could kind of change how the Big Ten did things offensively, and they found that no, actually, when it gets cold and it gets tough, you've got to be able to run the ball and be really physically tough, and you can't just outspeed people. So you're right. Like, there is going to have to still be that physical element. They still need to recruit and develop offensive linemen like they have at Wisconsin, who can just be these big, massive dudes who can move people around. But I think that Luke Fickell, they lost a good amount to the portal. They added up quite a bit. I'm not saying Wisconsin is going to have a monster year in year one with Fickell, but certainly Longo was a really interesting choice for the OC job, and a guy who's trying to move up and get head jobs and stuff like that. And so I think he's got a lot to prove this year.
Max, I saw a video of Matt Rule coaching up Nebraska a day or two ago. It's cool to see, him, doing his thing out there. And I know this is kind of a year where I don't think there are any great expectations. I think there's an understanding of it's year number one, but Jeff Sims certainly looks the part. What has been some of the early intel just on their offense, how that's coming together, and Jeff Sims as quarterback in particular?
Yeah, this coaching staff really has a ton of belief in Jeff Sims, and Matt Rule has said from the start when they picked him up that they felt like he's an NFL player. He's a big 6'4" dual threat quarterback who I think can give them a lot in the run game. He's rushed for over 1,500 yards in his career at Georgia Tech. When you take out sacks, and the last 2 years has been banged up and has only been able to play 6-7 games, but in each of those seasons, but I think they just feel like, man, he's absolutely what they needed to kind of start building that culture this year. Around him, they've got a few backs that they think can play. The receiver group's a little bit of a question mark. The offensive line was brutal last year and needs to be much improved. But I think Nebraska's going to get some really good challenges early. They open with Minnesota next Thursday. They've got Colorado. They've got Michigan, I think, for their fifth game. I think it's, we're going to find out pretty quick, are these guys kind of buying in and do they have enough to be more competitive? But you're right. You watch the videos and you can clearly see Matt Rule is back in his element, coaching up college kids like he's meant to. And, I think there's a lot of positive signs in terms of which way this is trending so far.
Yeah, and his trend was to not do well the first year at Temple and absolutely not do well at Baylor. And there were actually some that thought that by doing that, you lower the bar and then maybe take a little pressure off when you're going to increase who you are. Doesn't it all come down to what the quarterback play is going to be with Sims? Because they've had spotty quarterback play, even though Martinez could be dynamic, and at times Casey Thompson could throw it all over the place. They just haven't had somebody they could truly rely on that's more of a workman-like guy.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the record for Nebraska this year is going to heavily depend on, can you get 12 games out of Jeff Sims? And he's dealt with a bunch of injuries the last 2 years. And, it's not to say that the guys behind him, Chava Purdy and Heinrich Harburg, are awful, but they're certainly very unproven. And I think that, the rushing ability of Jeff Sims, especially kind of get them out of trouble, make plays on third downs, things like that. I think that's going to be really important for them offensively in terms of moving the ball. You hope that doesn't mean put him in too much danger. Certainly, you saw Casey Thompson took a lot of hits last year behind a bad O line and missed a bunch of games. And so, the ability to keep him healthy is going to be critical here. But I think they feel like they're starting off in a little bit better position here at quarterback, than you did year one. You think back to starting a new Solomon and a very young Charlie Brewer.
Max, thank you very much as always. Glad you're feeling better. Can't wait. The season's here. Let's go.
Let's go.
Yep. Max Olson, The Athletic, with us on 365 Sports. Nicole Arbach in about an hour.